Long before her name became associated with one of the most mysterious legends of medieval Brittany, Noyala was remembered simply as a young woman born into a world where almost every important decision had already been made for her. According to Breton tradition, Noyala was born in Britain sometime around the early Middle Ages, traditionally placed around the 5th or 6th century. Some accounts describe her as the daughter of a British king or powerful prince. If these traditions preserve even part of her true origins, she would have grown up surrounded by privileges unimaginable to ordinary people of her time. But royal blood came with invisible chains. A princess did not belong entirely to herself. Her marriage could strengthen an alliance, settle a dispute, secure territory, or guarantee the loyalty of another ruler. Her future could be discussed by powerful men long before anyone thought to ask what she wanted. And Noyala wanted something entirely different. From an early age, tradition remembers her as deeply attracted to the Christian faith. Christianity had already spread through parts of Britain, although the political and religious landscape remained complicated. Older Celtic customs survived alongside Christian communities, while the collapse of Roman authority had left Britain divided among competing kingdoms and local rulers. It was into this unstable world that Noyala's religious vocation supposedly emerged. While others saw a princess destined for marriage, she began imagining a life dedicated entirely to God. According to the devotional tradition surrounding her, Noyala eventually made a private vow of chastity. It was a decision that may have seemed intensely personal to her, but for a royal daughter, it carried potentially enormous consequences. Because sooner or later, someone would come asking for her hand, and eventually, someone did. Tradition tells of a powerful pagan nobleman who desired Noyala as his wife. To those around the royal household, the proposal may have appeared advantageous. A marriage between important families could provide security and political influence. But Noyala saw something else. She saw the destruction of the promise she believed she had made to God, and so she refused. Perhaps the first refusal was dismissed as youthful stubbornness. Perhaps relatives attempted to persuade her. Perhaps promises were made about the comfortable life awaiting her. We cannot know the exact conversations that took place. The surviving story comes to us through religious tradition rather than contemporary eyewitness records. But the heart of the legend is remarkably consistent. Noyala would not surrender her religious vocation for marriage. Pressure increased. The palace that had once represented security now became something closer to a prison. Imagine the contradiction. Outside her chambers stood everything a person of that age could desire: food, protection, servants, status, perhaps lands that would someday become part of her inheritance. Yet none of it mattered if the price was losing control over her own conscience. Noyala faced an impossible choice: remain a princess and risk being forced into the future others had designed for her, or abandon everything. She chose to leave, and according to tradition, she did not leave with soldiers, treasure wagons, or a royal fleet. She fled accompanied only by her nurse or servant, a woman remembered in some versions as the faithful companion who would remain beside her through the darkest moments of her story. The contrast could hardly have been greater. One day, Noyala belonged to a royal household. Soon afterward, she was a fugitive moving toward the sea. Behind her were stone halls, warm fires, familiar faces, and the only homeland she had ever known. Ahead of her was water. Beyond that, water lay Armorica, the ancient region on the northwestern coast of what is now France, later known as Brittany. During this period, movement between Britain and Armorica was historically significant. Communities from the British Isles migrated across the Channel during the centuries following the decline of Roman rule, helping shape the Celtic character of Brittany. Languages, traditions, and religious practices traveled with them. Noyala's legend therefore places her journey within a real historical pattern of migration between the two regions. But knowing that others had crossed the sea would not have made the journey safe. For two women traveling with limited protection, the crossing could have been terrifying. There were no engines, no satellite navigation, no weather forecasts. A small vessel was exposed to sudden winds, rough currents, cold water, and storms capable of transforming a voyage into catastrophe. And somewhere along the British coast, Noyala stepped aboard. The shore slowly moved away. Every movement of the boat carried her farther from her father, her home, her title, and the marriage she had rejected. There must have been a moment when the coastline became almost invisible. Perhaps she looked back. Perhaps she understood that she might never see Britain again. There was no guarantee that Armorica would welcome her, no certainty that she would find food or shelter, no promise that the life waiting across the water would be easier than the one she had abandoned. But returning meant surrender, so the boat continued. Hours passed, surrounded by nothing but wind and water. The channel that separated Britain from continental Europe became a physical boundary between two versions of Noyala's life. Behind her was the princess. Ahead was the exile. Eventually, according to Breton tradition, Noyala reached the coast of Armorica. She had survived the crossing, but what she did next makes the story even more unusual. A royal refugee might naturally seek another noble household. Noyala could have attempted to find a Christian ruler willing to protect her. She could have searched for wealth, political asylum, or another life appropriate to her social position. Instead, tradition says she turned away from privilege almost completely. She traveled inland. The populated coastline gradually gave way to fields, ancient paths, valleys, and enormous stretches of forest. The Brittany of Noyala's legend was a landscape where Christianity was expanding through communities shaped by older Celtic traditions. Hermits and religious figures were often associated with isolated places, springs, forests, and settlements that later became important centers of local devotion. Noyala wanted obscurity. According to the legend, she and her companion eventually entered the countryside associated with what is now Morbihan, particularly the traditions surrounding Bigna and Noyal Pontivy. There, the former princess exchanged royal chambers for the wilderness. No servants arrived every morning, no banquet waited in the evening, no guards stood outside. Shelter would have been primitive. Food had to come from what could be gathered or obtained locally. Water came from natural springs. For someone raised in privilege, the transformation must have been enormous, but there was also something she had never possessed inside the palace: silence. In the forest, no council discussed whom she should marry. No nobleman negotiated over her future. No political alliance determined the value of her life. She could pray. She could disappear. And perhaps, for a brief period, Noyala believed she had finally escaped. But isolation carried its own danger. A mysterious foreign woman living in the Breton countryside would not remain unnoticed forever. Stories traveled quickly in small communities. People began speaking about the stranger. She was young. She was foreign. Her manner suggested noble origins, and according to the legend, her beauty made her particularly difficult to ignore. Eventually, those rumors reached a man whose name would become inseparable from the darkest part of Noyala's story. He is remembered in Breton tradition as Nizan, a powerful local lord or tyrant. Somewhere in his territory lived a mysterious British woman who had rejected wealth, hidden herself in the wilderness, and devoted her life to a god he did not worship. Nizan became curious, then interested, and according to the legend, that interest soon became obsession. The same conflict Noyala had crossed the sea to escape was slowly finding her again among the forests of Brittany. Had you ever heard of Saint Noyala before today? Have you, or anyone you know, ever received a blessing, a miracle, or the intercession of Saint Noyala? Write it down in the comments below. I read every single one of your comments, and I'll leave a heart on yours. If this story warms your heart, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends and family so they can strengthen their faith too. The saints were forgotten once. And together, we will never let that happen again. The fury of the tyrant and the blade at her throat. For a brief time, Noyala may have believed that the forests of Brittany had finally hidden her from the world. She had crossed the sea to escape a future imposed upon her. She had abandoned the security of royal life, traveled into an unfamiliar land, and chosen isolation over privilege. In the countryside of ancient Armorica, far from the political expectations of Britain, she had finally found the silence she wanted. But silence does not always mean safety. Word of the mysterious foreign woman began to spread. Travelers spoke of a young woman living quietly in the region. Villagers noticed that she was not an ordinary wanderer. Her speech, her manners, and perhaps even the way she carried herself suggested an upbringing very different from that of a peasant. Some believed she came from across the sea. Others may have heard that she was of noble blood. Eventually, according to Breton tradition, these stories reached a powerful local ruler remembered by the name Nizan. And from that moment, Noyala's refuge began to turn into a trap. Nizan is remembered in the legend as a pagan lord or tyrant who exercised authority over the surrounding territory. Historical documentation about the man himself is extremely limited, and much of what survives belongs to later religious tradition. Yet within the legend of Saint Noyala, his role is unmistakable. He represents the very power she had fled Britain to escape. When Nizan heard about the foreign woman, curiosity drew him toward her. But according to the story, curiosity quickly became desire. Imagine the first encounter. Noyala had deliberately stripped away almost everything that once revealed her royal status. There was no crown on her head. No elaborate court surrounded her. No royal guards announced her arrival. Yet Nizan saw something in her that fascinated him. The woman standing before him had rejected the world he understood. For a ruler accustomed to influence and obedience, that refusal may have been impossible to comprehend. Nizan wanted her, and he apparently believed his authority would be enough to make her accept him. According to the traditional narrative, he demanded that Noyala become his wife. Some later retellings describe his intentions in even darker terms, portraying him as determined to possess her regardless of what she wanted. But Noyala had already faced this choice once. She had sacrificed her homeland because of it. She had crossed dangerous waters because of it. She had exchanged a palace for a life of hardship because of it. There was little reason to believe that she would surrender now. She refused him. For Nizan, the answer may have been shocking. Powerful rulers of that age were not accustomed to being openly contradicted, particularly by someone living within territory they considered their own. Perhaps he thought she had misunderstood. Perhaps he offered protection. Perhaps he reminded her of his position. The legend does not preserve their exact words. What it preserves is the essential confrontation Nizan demanded. Noyala refused, and the more firmly she resisted, the more dangerous the encounter became. Her faithful companion was reportedly nearby, unable to protect her from armed men. Noyala stood almost entirely alone. She had no father there to defend her, no soldiers, no political allies, no ship waiting on the coast. Only the conviction that had already cost her everything. According to Christian traditions surrounding her, Noyala explained that she had consecrated herself to God and would not break that commitment. For Nizan, this was no longer merely rejection, it was humiliation. The woman he desired was telling him that neither his authority nor his threats could change her decision. His anger intensified. The forest that had once protected Noyala now isolated her from anyone who might intervene. The confrontation reached its breaking point. Nizan gave her one final opportunity to submit. She refused again. And then the ruler reached for his weapon. The sight alone must have terrified Noyala's companion. There was no trial, no distant prison, no long legal proceeding. According to the legend, judgment and punishment happened almost immediately. Noyala knew what was coming. She had escaped one powerful man only to stand defenseless before another. But something fundamental had changed. There was nowhere else to flee. The sea was far behind her. And even if escape had been possible, the same question would continue following her. How much must a person surrender merely to remain alive? For Noyala, the answer had already been decided. Her life could be taken. Her decision could not. Nizan's fury overwhelmed whatever restraint remained. According to the centuries-old Breton tradition, Noyala was killed by decapitation. The act was sudden and final. Her companion watched helplessly as the young woman she had followed from Britain fell silent. For Nizan and the men around him, the confrontation was over. The foreign princess who had challenged his authority would never refuse him again. Or so they believed. Because this is the precise moment when the story of Saint Noyala leaves the boundaries of an ordinary martyrdom account and enters the mysterious world of medieval Christian legend. What happened next would eventually place Noyala among a remarkable group of saints known as cephalophores, literally head carriers. Similar traditions developed around other Christian martyrs in medieval Europe, most famously Saint Denis of Paris. In these legends, decapitation did not immediately end the martyr's journey. Instead, the saint miraculously carried his or her own head to a chosen place of burial. For medieval Christians, the imagery carried an extraordinary symbolic message. The persecutor could determine the manner of death, but he could not determine the martyr's final destination. And according to Breton tradition, that is exactly what happened in the forest after Nizan killed Noyala. The men who had witnessed the execution expected stillness. Instead, something impossible began. Noyala's body moved. According to the legend, it did not simply collapse and remain where Nizan had condemned her. It rose. The witnesses must have stared in disbelief. Her companion, already overwhelmed by what she had seen, now watched something that seemed to violate every law of nature. The body bent toward the ground. Then, according to the tradition repeated for centuries in Brittany, Noyala lifted her own head into her hands. No one could have expected what followed. She did not move toward Nizan. There was no act of revenge. She simply turned away and began walking. Step after step, the young martyr moved deeper into the Breton countryside while carrying the unmistakable sign of the punishment that was supposed to have ended her story. Her terrified and astonished companion followed behind. Nizan had attempted to decide where Noyala's life would end, but according to the legend, even that decision would not belong to him. The journey had begun again. The journey of the bloody footsteps and the miraculous springs. The execution should have been the final moment of Noyala's story. According to the ancient Breton legend, however, death marked the beginning of her most mysterious journey. After the sentence was carried out, those who had witnessed it expected the forest to return to silence. Nizan had demonstrated his authority, and the foreign woman who had refused him could no longer challenge his will. But tradition says something impossible happened. Noyala's body rose. She took her own head into her hands, turned away from the place where she had been condemned, and began to walk. Her faithful companion followed. There was no explanation for where Noyala was going. No one had prepared a grave for her. No religious procession waited beyond the trees. Yet, according to the legend, her movement seemed deliberate. She was searching for the place where she wished to be buried. The journey carried her through the countryside of Brittany, across primitive paths, valleys, fields, and forests. Local traditions would later connect different locations in Morbihan with stages of this extraordinary route. particularly the regions surrounding Bignan and Noyal-Pontivy. For generations, these communities preserved different pieces of the same story. Bignan remembered the martyrdom. Noyal-Pontivy remembered what came afterward. And the distance separating those places created one of the strangest elements of the legend. Noyala did not simply take a few miraculous steps. She continued traveling. Imagine her companion walking behind her. This was the same woman who, according to tradition, had left Britain with Noyala. She had crossed dangerous waters beside her, exchanged the security of civilization for an uncertain existence in Armorica, and remained with her when Nizan appeared. Now she was following her mistress on a journey that seemed to defy nature itself. The path continued deeper into the Breton landscape. And then, according to local tradition, Noyala stopped. She had reached a valley. Even within a miraculous story, there is a strangely human detail preserved here. Noyala was said to have become exhausted. She needed to rest. Tradition associates this moment with an ancient stone later remembered as the bed of Saint Noyala. Mikhaemdi, there the wandering martyr paused. And this is where another extraordinary part of the legend begins. According to the tradition preserved around Noyal-Pontivy, 3 drops fell to the earth. Versions of the story differ in their details, but the drops became associated with Noyala's martyrdom and miraculous journey. Where they touched the ground, water emerged. Not 1 spring, 3. The place became known as Les Trois Fontaines, the 3 fountains. Unlike many details of ancient hagiographic legends that survive only in manuscripts or oral traditions, these fountains became physical places of devotion. The cultural heritage authorities of Brittany have documented the fountains and the centuries-old tradition connecting them with Saint Noyala. Over time, pilgrims came. The water acquired a reputation in popular devotion for healing, particularly for illnesses and pains involving the head. The symbolism was unmistakable. A martyr remembered for carrying her own head became a saint invoked by people suffering from ailments of the head. Parents brought children. The sick came searching for relief. Families prayed. Generations repeated the story until the landscape itself became inseparable from Noyala's name. Structures were eventually built around the springs, transforming natural water sources into devotional monuments. One of the fountains bears a date associated with the year 1600, demonstrating how deeply rooted the devotion had become many centuries after Noyala was traditionally believed to have lived. But according to the legend, Noyala did not remain beside the springs. After resting, she continued. Her destination was still ahead. The landscape opened before her once again. Her companion followed as they traveled toward the territory that would eventually become associated with Noyal-Pontivy. The similarity between the saint's name and the place itself became deeply embedded in local tradition. Whatever the complicated historical and linguistic origins of the name, generations came to understand the region through the memory of the mysterious British martyr. Eventually, Noyala reached the place she had been seeking. There was no great basilica there, no magnificent tomb, only the quiet Breton countryside. According to the traditional narrative preserved in local religious art, Noyala finally stopped. The impossible journey was over. She placed her head beside her and rested upon the earth. Her companion remained close. The young princess who had once possessed the possibility of royal burial in Britain had chosen a completely different resting place in a foreign land, and centuries later, people would build above that memory. A sanctuary dedicated to Saint Noyala eventually stood at Noyal-Pontivy. The present chapel belongs to a much later period than the saint's legendary lifetime, with its construction beginning in the 15th century. Its architecture, religious artwork, and surrounding devotional landscape became enduring witnesses to the strength of her cult in Brittany. Inside the sanctuary, Noyala's story was preserved not merely through words, but through images. Artists depicted scenes from the legend so that people who could not read could still understand what had happened. The foreign princess, the persecution, the martyrdom, the extraordinary journey, the fountains, and the saint carrying the symbol of her own death. The chapel eventually became recognized as an important historical monument, preserving centuries of Breton religious heritage. But another location also refused to forget her. Near Bézieux, in the region of Bignan, a chapel dedicated to Saint Noyala became associated with the place of her martyrdom. Religious traditions there preserved the memory of Nizar and the confrontation that supposedly ended her earthly life. Thus, two places became connected by one impossible journey. One remembered where Noyala was killed, the other remembered where she chose to rest. And between them stood the fountains. For medieval believers, the message contained within the legend would have been powerful. Nizar had possessed political authority. He believed that by ending Noyala's life, he could decide her fate. But the legend reverses that power completely. He could condemn her, he could order her death, but he could not determine where her journey ended. Noyala continued forward until she reached the place she had chosen for herself. And as centuries passed, something remarkable happened. The tyrant gradually disappeared into obscurity, but the woman he tried to silence became part of the landscape. Her name remained attached to chapels. Her image remained carved and painted in sacred spaces. Water continued flowing from fountains associated with her memory. Pilgrims continued arriving, and long after the kingdoms and rulers of her age had vanished, the old roads of Brittany continued leading travelers toward the places where tradition says the mysterious princess from across the sea had walked.